Welcome, everyone. Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Christ consciousness. Well, I want to cover now briefly the statement by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, a high-ranking, obviously, intelligence officer in the military for a career, and what he stated a couple of years before his death when he was pretty much knew that he was dying from cancer. Apparently, so the story goes, in 2015, he was diagnosed with serious cancer. They removed a large part of his, I believe, his intestine and stomach, and he barely survived. 5 years later, he then died in 2020. That was 2015. Apparently, after going through cancer treatments and so forth, he had a typical scenario, and the scenario was that he went into remission for a little while, and then it came back. How many times have we heard that? But here he was in his last interview, or very close to his last interview. I'm not sure exactly which one, but he certainly died months after this. After making this statement on a particular radio show on YouTube with a interviewer that he spoke to many times and felt was real and communicated with him well. This person is not a Satanist, I find out, but he just puts on different people, etc. If you look up my other lectures, you'll find some links to some of these. But very few people sit down and listen to these lectures. This particular person had several interviews with him that lasted over an hour. So there's 4 or 5 hours of interviews with Michael Aquino talking and giving him a chance to set the record straight of what he was involved in, etc. And at this point, he must care little or nothing. So the whole idea of of ramifications. Of course, you got to remember that he is not an island. He has children, possibly as many as 3. We're pretty sure there's 2. They aren't his directly, but apparently Lilith had 2 children. He may have had one as well. There's a murky history. While we know a lot about his family, and by the way, his mother died of cancer, and I'm assuming probably his father did. So there's cancer in the family, and she died fairly young. I think it was the late 60s and so forth. He was 73 or something, somewhere in that range. Again, don't hold me to these exact numbers. It's hard to do masses of research and keep all this straight, and I have a terrible memory to begin with, being very dyslexic. So the whole idea is that he had nothing to lose at this point to a certain degree. Now, they will come after your family, and this is a technique that if you talk, they just don't particularly go after you. They could possibly go after your family. And of course, Lilith is now pushing 80, I think. And this was a couple of years ago, so she was up in there. And there are other things. So they can go after you. They can go after your state. Apparently, there's some alienation from whatever children there are there, and they weren't even notified of his death. So the gossip goes, I have no idea. Apparently, there's some sort of legal suit by his son trying to get at his estate and find out what is happening. But of course, in California, all of your assets go to your wife in a community property estate unless there's a will stating the difference. And apparently there was bad communication. Just to clarify things, because family is important. They don't threaten just you. And a lot of people say, well, I don't care. Go ahead and threaten me. But when they threaten your family and everything else, there are problems. But he doesn't have this big extended family. But if you got 2 kids, you got 2 kids. And whether they're Liliths or not is unimportant. They're still in his family and have been, but there's some strange issue there. But what did he say about 9/11? Now, again, we have to assume that this goes around the military and officers, and that there is a understanding at least on a street level, a officer club drinking level, of what actually happened there. And being in the intelligence industry and him working for the CIA and DIA, several things. The only thing apparently he didn't work for, so it is claimed again, was the NSA, who he thought were a bunch of stuffed shirts, and apparently didn't work. But we don't know. That could be just a front. Some people say he worked for them, and he even was given the rank of general. Again, hearsay, fantasy, comic book stuff. No verification of any of this stuff, but it's kind of interesting to bounce around. That's what makes these kind of ridiculous cases kind of interesting, because they don't really impact our lives. People are being murdered and die all the time. There's huge pedophilia rings going on. People are giving billions of dollars to foreign countries ran by Nazis. I mean, there's so many things out there that we have while our own people sleep on the street. I mean, there's lots of issues here. We're having a little bit of mic problems that are really important. And these things about people who are dead are making even less. But this is what he said. Now, he mentioned this in 2 interviews. His last interview, or close to his last interview, he gave more details on what 9/11 was about. The first interview, he gave basic details, but now he went into greater details. He said that 9/11 was staged by Mossad, the Israelis, the CIA, and the FBI. They engineered that entire thing that happened. What happens is that no planes ever hit those buildings. Those were all projected images. There were other things. There were no planes that hit the Pentagon, and of course that fake crash with the heroes on it who phoned in their stuff, which phones don't work on planes. Anyway, if you're up in the air, all that fantasy stuff, there were no planes involved. The 3 planes involved in these certain issues were taken to a military base, completely disassembled and scrapped, and the passengers were all murdered. This is what he stated himself. So that's exactly what happened, and this was all done by the FBI, the CIA, and he even criticizes the director of the CIA at that time, who he considers a great scumbucket, and nobody should trust anything that this guy says. Now, that's what the intelligence community was thinking of the head of the FBI at that particular time during 9/11. Quite a shocking statement. All of this is shocking. The fact that this was all a put on, this was staged not only by our own intelligence people, but, he loves to blame the Jews. He hates the Jews. He is a Nazi. So we do have to understand that. But the whole idea was to stage this. And, as much as everybody likes to blame the Jews, and they're so jealous of them because, there is only 17 million Jews, and they kind of do everything. They're massively involved in the legal system, doctors, scientists, etc. I mean, these are a genius race of people, and they're not even necessarily practicing Jews, as most Jews aren't, or a large percentage of that 17 million, but they are a major influence, which is quite fascinating when you look at these things. So he did dump on them, and his conclusion to this is what was done, and this was all done to, as he put it, and to quote him, to kiss the Jews' ass. This is all to work with them, to assist them in any ways to get this great support for them against Islam. So, if they did do that, because then I certainly can't blame them. From the beginning of time, people have murdered Jews right now. They walk into schools and other places and just kill Jews all the time. Going back in history, the Jews have been persecuted everywhere they've went. And they have been murdered. At the start of the Crusades, which they don't tell you, is that all the Crusaders went out and killed the Jews and stole all their money and property to finance the crusade. This, of course, is something that goes on constantly through Jewish history right up to the Second World War. There was no hatred of the Jews. They had all the money. And the National Socialists just needed to kill them to get their money, and they did that to every country they went because there was giant bank accounts with the money in it that these very successful people had. That's what's behind it. The rest of it is just a con. The bottom line is that anybody who knows anything knows that Aryans are basically Iranians. That's where they come from. That's where Arya is. And they are not Europeans. They're not Nordics. They're not Anglo-Saxons. They are Aryans, and they called themselves that for a reason because that's where they come from. So let's understand that as well. A lot of people don't know that. But this is what he stated. He stated that, and that this was all part of our support for Israel to the ultimate degree. Now, I think there's an awful lot that he didn't say there, and maybe he doesn't know. We have to remember that there's the two trade towers, of course, with those photos that never looked real to me, and it didn't seem like there was enough damage going in or going out. I mean, the planes went into the building like a special effect and kind of sucked the plane in. It didn't seem like there was much damage there. And of course, there was a perfect picture of it. How convenient that we have a perfect picture at a perfect distance and everything else. There was even supposedly passports found on the streets of New York City that somehow flew out of the airplane onto the street, identifying the hijackers. But people are so stupid. There's also a huge amount of other damage. There seems to have been particle beam weapons used, laser type weapons, because there was certain cars and other things melted blocks away. I think there's a whole multitude of special weapons that were used here and tested. Obviously, it was demolitioned, and so it would fall straight down. Buildings don't do that unless you blow them up. And of course, there were people in there the weekend before the building was closed and the people were running lines. It was so obvious. But the major thing that he didn't mention is Building 7, which is nowhere near the towers. At least, I don't know about nowhere near, but Building 7 was the basic emergency building for the city of New York. This is where everybody fled to in case of an emergency. It was loaded with secret files from the CIA court cases, the Enron. All of that was destroyed. And that building was demolished yet again. That fell straight down. No plane hit it, just fell straight down. I guess it was the breeze from the Twin Towers, kind of. There's so much breeze from that building itself fell down. And nobody really looks at that. So, the trade towers are a ruse. It's a red herring again. Everybody's looking at those two buildings and those airplanes while they're over there blowing up and getting rid of a whole bunch of records that would basically the evidence against a huge amount of very rich people, and people wanted to get rid of them. The amount of records that were in that building is astonishing, including records from what some detectives have said of Son of Sam and other things were all in those buildings as well. A lot of police records in general. So it's quite fascinating. But that's what he stated what happened, which is pretty shocking to think that these planes would be taken, landed, the people would be murdered, their bodies disposed of, the plane would be then all carted up and brought somewhere else. I don't know what they did with the engines and other things, but all of that stuff, any way that could be traced to that, was destroyed. That's what a high-ranking intelligence officer stated happened. So I have to believe that he has some inside information. But again, a lot is left out, and that's very typical of Aquino. He will give you a certain amount of information, but he doesn't step over the line too much. He's not going to bring in Building 7, talk about the criminal cases that were there, and everything else. That's so typical of him. But his explanation of what happens, of course, makes a lot of sense. There were pictures of a missile hitting the Pentagon from a store across the street. There was nothing found at that plane that ran into the ground. They didn't find any engines or anything else. It was a big setup there. So it was quite obvious this whole thing was a giant setup. They pull the wool over your eyes. They feed you with nonsense. And of course, this is exactly what happened. And here we have what I think is a pretty good understanding with a lot of giant holes in it that you could drive Mack trucks through. But it gives you an idea of what happened, that this was definitely a staged red flag, is that what they call it, red flag event that was staged. And that the whole thing was done for a political purpose. And the deaths, of course, were minimal. Those buildings could have been full. So the whole thing was about as clean as you can get, well planned, and everyone, there was a large group of people involved in it, and this goes to all your intelligence agencies, which Aquino had good connection with. He has claimed, and that he has worked extensively with the FBI and extensively with the CIA. So you would assume that he got some kind of information, and that this tends to be one of those things that people talk about within small little groups, but do not make it public. So here's yet again, who are we going to get information from? Well, it's going to be the freaky weirdo, and that's exactly what Michael Aquino was. We're not going to get top officers coming out. They're going to give you the company line. I was shocked recently with Wesley Clark, who I thought was a fairly good military officer, was telling a lot of disinformation about this Ukrainian war that was going on, which was just bogus nonsense, and he must have known it. I mean, how can you not? So the whole idea is that, so you're not going to get that from anybody. You're not going to get it except from a guy like him, and he feels, I'm sure he feels betrayed that he was a career officer, did a lot, and he was pushed out of a lot of things. And of course, he was kept out of Stargate projects, the remote viewing stuff, all that stuff I think he was pushed out of. And he came to the conclusion after that, there is no psychic power. And that all that was bogus and was a dumb project. Now, or he was involved in it and nobody talks about it. So I'm not really sure what's going on. You never know what's going on with any of these things. But certainly, here's a guy who knows he's going to die, and pretty shortly. And he was going through his last phases of life here, and because this was I believe the year or so before he died, or maybe months before he died. I'm not entirely sure when these actual interviews took place. So when we have another one on him talking about the ultimate red flag, which is World War III, so everybody can get rich again and get out of their economy doldrums, which all of the world is stuck in. This is the usual thing they do. And this is very dangerous when we have a nuclear armed. Everybody's got nuclear weapons. India, Pakistan, China, Russia, and everywhere. So, I mean, there's so many nuclear weapons out there that we're talking about some very scary stuff. And the fact that this is not a joke, and the whole ridiculous Ukrainian war is really, if you read the history and everything else and know what's going on here, it's ridiculous. And so we need to know who's going to give out this kind of information. You're not going to have a top active or even retired military officer coming out and saying this. You're going to get it from the freaks and weirdos. Now, the bottom line is, how good is his information? I think Aquino thinks he was everybody's buddy. I don't think that's the case at all. I think a lot that was told him as disinformation that they wanted him to know as that area, meaning they gave him wrong information because that's what they wanted him to know. So all of this is part of so it's a complicated case, but take that for what you may. It is a high-ranking source. You can't get this kind of information. I mean, this is an intelligence officer with many contacts. He claims he knew everybody in the PSYOPs and the alternative people. General John Alexander, the famous guy who's out there with the Stargate program and all these other ones, and looking for alternative weapons, and claims that he believes in and is in favor of psychic abilities. So all of these people he claims and they're all good friends. Everybody he talks about is a good friend. He also claims who shot JFK, which I have stated in a different lecture, and I'll probably make a little mini on that as well. So take this as you may. Some more fascinating information from the strange, odd person that Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, founder of the Temple of Set. What a weird, wild way to get information from. And oddly enough, it may be the real stuff.